Chapter 2. Suburb of London. My father looked forward to providing a new house in a better environment for his wife and new son. They were living in rental accommodation in Sudbury town. He read about a house being for rent in North Harrow, which might provide the answer to his quest. The Metropolitan line connecting him to his work at Marylebone Station's goods yard was an added bonus. All the roads in North Harrow were named after counties and county towns, and had not long been finished by the builders. Number 31 Cumberland Road was vacant, and provided just the sort of living area and garden my parents were looking for. It was perfect. My father, paying the deposit, arranged to move in that autumn. Later in life I asked my father why he rented. His reply was, "I believe it allows flexibility of movement, and that over a period of time maintenance and depreciation makes ownership uneconomic." I wonder now whether this was not just an excuse to compensate for my parents' age difference, and that he couldn't face up to the realities of social progress and changing circumstances. He never gave voice to what was to happen when he retired, that ownership might provide security in old age. Perhaps my father didn't want the responsibility after experiencing the useless slaughter in the First World War. His perspective, shaped by the transience of war, or was it to give larger donations to Masonic Lodge? We will never know, but in the event it was a bad decision, which revealed itself later in my tale. Number 31 was built in 1933, with 2 reception rooms, 3 bedrooms, a kitchen and an upstairs bathroom. The exterior walls pebble-dashed and the bay roof and gable end hipped. The side entrance, behind a close-boarded wooden gate, led to the back garden. At the front of the house, facing the road and acting as a boundary to the neighbours, the obligatory privet hedge, standing 4 feet high. The hedge almost smoothed a low cinder brick wall, built round wooden posts supporting a barbed broad-linked chain, which also served as a boundary marker to the house next door. The house, built on a slight right-hand bend halfway down the road, the even numbers ranged opposite. Following the building line and almost directly facing our house, 4 lock-up garages with glazed wooden doors, one of which housed my father's car, loaned to him for official duty for the duration of the war. The other 3 remained empty throughout. My father's car was an Austin 14, a large square-shaped saloon with leather seats, bulbous mudguards, and the battery and spare wheel bolted onto the running board. On most days it had to have the engine turned over with the starting handle, with the choke fully out. This control of the butterfly valve always started to work its way back to the open position. To ensure the engine fired, the driver had to pull out the choke, leap from the seat to the grill, turn the engine until it fired, bound back into the car to catch the engine firing before the choke retracted back to its open position. This daily exercise guaranteed the driver was fully awake before chancing his life to the road. Our family doctor had his surgery just past the small line of shops, up on the left past the crossroads. Dr. Mayer was a large-framed, loose-limbed Irishman who hardly ever moved from his swivel chair. His waiting room, to the left of the front door, was entered off the small hall. A sign directed the patient to enter. As soon as the door was opened, a number of glaring eyes greeted you. There was no means of knowing who the last was to enter. To know your place in the queue, you had to either remember or recognize all who were there. or ask. It was very rare for this to happen. This uncertainty created its own degree of nervous anxiety, overlaid your already weakened state of physical or mental health. The ill-hung lace curtain behind full-length blackout curtains covered the windows. Peeling posters and scuffed linoleum floor did nothing to entice the visitor to linger. The kitchen chairs ranged round the sides of the bleak room allowed the group of coughing and sneezing patients to examine each other carefully over their magazines. Each scrutinized for signs of infectious disease or distressing habit. In the centre of the room, a green baize-covered table held a pile of ancient magazines. These gave only limited distraction to the desperate company, men wanting a chit to enable them to take time off work, and children time off school. Posters declared the horrors of measles, mumps, and TB, and one, the latest government warning, declared that talk costs lives. The low wattage bulb, its illuminate quality severely restricted by a fringe-decorated coolie hat shade, attempted to offer some much-needed light to the wartime patients waiting to act on the summons of a piercing bell. The rattling striker of the distressed bell emitted a throttled bring. The assembled company jerked into life. Their hearts pounded. The next patient, checking his position in the order of entry, lurched to his feet. Placing his magazine carefully on the table, attempted to leave the room unseen and unheard, his trailing scarf dragged on the floor. There was very little science on offer, precious little comfort, and no privacy. Every flat surface of his consulting room filled to overflowing with strewn papers, sample dishes, stethoscope, microscope, torch, ruler, bottles of pills, and pink-coloured jalap. Dr. Mayer started to write out a prescription before you had even taken your seat. "What can I do for you, my son?" On the other side of the road was the dentist, Mr. Hudson. He was the very antithesis of Dr. Mayer. He was short, erect and slim, quick of action and slow to rile. He operated a belt-driven drill with the dexterity of a diamond cutter. Its rotating belt spun round as the coarse drill ground in. I had a good reason to admire his expertise and technical qualities. Our neighbours on the right were the Williams. Sons, Frank and Victor, attended John Lyons School. On the left, Mr. and Mrs. Tripps kept a very low profile, being hardly ever seen. He was a professional gambler of greyhounds, and she a dedicated homemaker. Both stood high on our list as good neighbours. The former's garden contained 2 delicious apple trees, and the latter a cherry, both raided during the summer holidays. They ignored our many boyish escapades. I don't remember my father ever talking to either neighbour or passing the time of day with anyone in the street. He only recognized them by raising his hat. We never had a friend of my father's visit the house, except 2 maiden aunts and our grandmother at Christmas time. His social life was at the Masonic Hall, and with the old Contemptible Association. My mother had 3 friends who called during the day. I never knew my parents to have a party or socialize. A bow-topped, slatted wooden gate, painted drab green, greeted visitors to the house. It was the only means of entry to the house and garden. This reluctant guardian to the estate snapped either shut with the force of a rat trap, retrieved by an over-tightened coiled spring, or more often than not was propped open by a brick. The open gate allowed you to enter up the quarry-tiled front path, flanked by black serrated edging tiles. Flower beds on either side of the path were planted up, with rather poor roses on the right and Michaelmas daisies on the left, both needing some of Mum's acquired horse manure. The clay soil was light dun-coloured, forever needing lots of humus to grow anything really well. London Pride and grape hyacinths gave a cheerful display as an edging, and under the sitting-room bay windows a clump of white lilies leant over to greet the sun, as the panelled front door, with noticeable bubbled paint, stood before you under a canopy of sheet lead. The glazed panel of the front door, the hall window, landing, and small fanlights to the sitting-room were of stained glass, set in lead. These dictated the architectural style of the period. Only the hall, stairs, and landing had a dado rail, plus a picture rail. All the woodwork, including the doors, architraves, door frames, skirting, and stair surrounds, were stained brown to resemble dark oak, as was the embossed Lincruster wallpaper below the dado line. The decoration copied more expensive properties, using cheaper mediums to achieve the effect. Standard house design after the war did not include stained glass, leaded lights, or rough-cast walls. Lath and plaster gave way to plasterboard. Hung wooden floors became a concrete raft, and chimneys defunct by side wall vents for gas boilers. Plate racks, picture and dado rails, coved ceilings, stair spindles, all were outdated. Plain mouldings replaced ogee for windows and door architraves. Where possible, concrete used instead of brick, tile or wood. It was the period of utility and the adoption of the kite mark. It took many years before substantial housing was built with anything like the same attention to detail and solidness of construction. By convention, houses of the period were painted either green and cream or brown and cream. Ours was the only exception, relying on what my father could acquire from work, which was usually battleship grey. At the end of the hall, facing the front door, hung a picture of the royal coat of arms, flanked by two of my father's dress swords. Decorating the wall next to the front door on the right, where crossed imitation Roman swords hung either side of a silvered mirror. On the wall opposite stood the hall stand, completely covered in numerous coats, hats, scarves, umbrellas, and walking sticks. Built into the centre of the hall stand, a glove box under a mirror. Coat hooks screwed into the dado rail next to the hall stand lined the wall up to the stairs. The hooks strained with the weight of umpteen coats, scarves, and hats. Shoes peeped out from beneath the coats, and under the stairs a larder and an overfilled hall cupboard. The larder had a marble slab and numerous shelves, a bread bin, cage for cold meats, cheese and butter dishes, plus jug of milk, all resided on the slab, and on the floor a vegetable basket with separate containers. Either side, on wall brackets, were shelves filled with condiments and bottled sauces. The larder, ventilated by a small holed wired grill covering a small window. This, too, was patched over with cardboard in the winter. The understair cupboard contained the Eubank carpet sweeper, dustpan and brush, Goblin cylinder vacuum cleaner that never worked, and a Singer sewing machine, which was my mother's pride and joy. Many shopping baskets and sundry bags. I cannot remember ever seeing the back of the cupboard. Health officials go on today about the necessity for cleanliness in the home and workplace, and caution against leaving food out of the refrigerator. We had no such warning strictures. The meat was eaten through. There was not a refrigerator or a meat safe, and if the milk went off, then you drank it or went without. In hot weather the milk was boiled, and the larder's marble slab was cold in all weathers. I never remember the larder ever taken apart and cleaned thoroughly, and I certainly don't remember anyone having an upset stomach. The cats kept the rats and mice at bay, and no one complained about the lack of hygiene. Father, not owning the house, felt it not incumbent upon him to maintain it. Therefore a very infrequent redecoration was all that the rooms ever received. By that I mean the ceilings were whitewashed using a lime powder with the addition of a blue bag to give a whiter effect, and the walls distempered using the same powder with the addition of coloured dye. The walls downstairs were papered, but in those days the paper was not trimmed. One side would have to be cut with scissors to overlap the previous sheet. We boys, halfway through the job, would start humming the tune when Father pasted the parlour, and this didn't go down very well. The result of almost zero maintenance over 10 years, the property underwent a slow deterioration. The final nail in the coffin was the Doodlebug V1 bomb, which finished off the job. After that, number 31 had an extensive refit. The furniture and furnishing remained the same. Items of furniture positioned covered up the bad decoration, damp patches and worn carpets. My mother made all the curtains, cushions and chair covers using her Singer sewing machine, kept in the cupboard under the stairs opposite the now best room. The best room, lounge or front room, was used as the formal dining room for the few visitors that dropped in and for very special occasions. It was undoubtedly the coldest, dampest, most uninviting room in the house. It held a large table that by operating a winder to turn the ratchet, the 2 outer leaves were pulled apart. A third leaf dropped in between. 4 dining chairs, 2 kitchen chairs and 2 carvers could be accommodated round its sides. This complicated operation only occurred at Christmas time, needing every resource available to keep my father calm. As every other gadget in the house, it was temperamental. A sideboard took up the entire wall immediately in front of the open door. 2 bookcases with glazed side cupboards stood either side of the chimney breast, one cupboard holding half-filled decanters and the other my father's service revolver. Placed on top a framed box containing my father's medals, taken out and worn once every year at the cenotaph, Remembrance Day service. Opposite the fire, the table, and taking up the only other wall, the bay window, looking out onto the street. A green-tiled fire surround and hearth with mirrored overmantel held the central position. On its wooden mantelshelf chimed a French clock my father brought back from France. No fireplace was complete without a fender and coal boxes. A fireplace companion set of poker, brush and shovel in a polished brass holder decorated the hearth. And perched on a high round table was a rather unhealthy-looking aspidistra in a round green glazed pot. This offending plant scattered innumerable small black seeds everywhere and led a charmed life. To my knowledge, never watered, but retained life. 2 upholstered armchairs with tassels on the arms either side of the fireplace tried to lift the room, giving it a feeling of comfort and warmth. They failed miserably. 2 heavy curtains on runners framed the bay windows, permanently covered by lace suspended on stretched wire. This lace shut out much of the light and gave the room formality. It also prevented scrutiny of what was going on in the room. Nobody ventured to disturb the net curtains. My father considered any movement linked to nosiness and impolite. It was the general rule for all houses of that period to have lace covering the windows. A framed, silver-plated oval mirror On chains separated two Scottish river scenes hung from the picture rail centred over the sideboard. Here, on top, was displayed the wooden nut bowl, biscuit barrel, and cut glass fruit bowl. The tasselled carpet square fitted into the surrounding border of linoleum, nailed down. A painted wood-standard lamp stood next to the round table holding the fern, which, when lit, cast a shadow of its tracery over the floor. The windows were hardly ever disturbed throughout the house, for if they were, they could never be closed. When we had our aunts to tea, a special effort was made to do everything perfectly. The cucumber, beetroot, mustard and cress sandwiches were made of white bread with the crust cut off. There would always be at least 2 cakes available, displayed on stands with paper dollies peeping out from beneath. The tea, cups, pot, basin, arranged with precision on the best tray, all graced the table on top of a pristine tablecloth with razor-sharp creases. The back room, originally built as the dining room, had French doors leading out onto the backyard and garden. We always used it as the sitting room. It offered privacy, which was lacking from the front, and what was convenient, it was on the warmest side of the house. A brass fender boxed in its maroon-tiled fire surround and hearth. This room only sat in at weekends when my father lit the fire. The overmantel held a large mirror, and various knick-knacks perched on the suspended shelves gave ornamentation. Pipe racks, spill containers, swan vesta matches and 2 porcelain figures of nubile dancers graced either ends of the mantelshelf. As previously described, all the floors close-boarded and frequently patched, and because of the poor ventilation, incessant damp abounded. Some floorboards were rotting, and plywood lay over these areas to stop people falling through to the void beneath. Newspapers placed under the carpet to give an added underlay. Unfortunately, these tended to smell, which all added to the slightly musty odour. Although coal and coke was available, much of the time wood was burnt, which caused much crackling and spitting and the occasional shower of sparks which fell onto the fireside rug. As the fire burned down, coal heaped on, and to get a good blaze, a metal plate which covered the whole fire placed in front. We called it the roarer, and its purpose was to draw in the draught from below the fire basket. This metal plate sometimes became red hot, and a rush was made to take it outside into the garden to cool it off. The soot at the back of the fireplace on the fire back glowed, and became the soldiers which climbed up the chimney, snuffed out when the draught cooled them down. The chimney to the sitting room had to be swept every year. It was Mum's job to distribute the soot around the garden. Heavy curtains on poles drawn tightly together to keep out any draughts covered the French doors. 2 upholstered armchairs and a settee, a pair of small cupboards either side of the fireplace, and the upright piano, with a stack of music on top, and its accompanying stool, which twiddled round, completed the furnishing. Light was provided by a low-wattage centre electric light bulb with a coolie hat fringed shade. A reproduction oil painting in a gilt frame of the Battle of Waterloo provided the wall decoration. On cold, stormy nights, with the wind whistling round the house and blowing through the upturned branches of the poplar tree in next door's garden, it was particularly comforting to be inside, in the warm. The rain, beating on the windows, invited the chairs to be drawn up close to form a semicircle round the fire. Once the rolled-up piece of carpet was thrust tight up against the bottom of the door to keep out the draughts. The radio set, tuned to the light programme. Henry Hall's Guest Night, Bandwagon with Arthur Askey and Richard Murdoch. The BBC Doctor Charles Hill, Friday Night is Music Night. Down Your Way with Franklin Engelman. In Town Tonight, Old-Time Dancing with Sidney Thompson. Valentine Dial as the Man in Black, and Edgar Lustgarten in Murder Intended. Lift Up Your Hearts, Life with the Lions with Ben and Bibi Daniels, Forces favourites from the British Forces Broadcasting Network in Germany with announcers Cliff Mitchellmore and Jean Metcalf, linking those at home to the forces aboard. Then the entertainment would begin. My mother would take up her knitting, usually from wool unpicked from an old jumper, and the cat would jockey for position before the fire. It took a brave person to disturb the well-lit pipe, the warm slippered feet, and the sense of peaceful tranquillity. My father's pipe would emit a stream of sweet-smelling rosemary. He was deep in his book. On most weekend evenings my father played the piano. I turned the music, and sometimes sang, from the Daily Express community songbook, which he loved me to do. As I sorted out the music, it was my business to choose whichever was looked hardest for my father to play. You could tell that by looking at the sheet music. If it was filled with black, then it was difficult, like the Hungarian dances, where the pages were thick with black notes. My father never turned down any piece, however difficult, and the old piano would almost bounce across the floor. The sound of the piano intensified by removing the front panel so that the action was exposed. This part of the piano held the hammers, which together with all the other wood and felt parts became damp in the winter. It must be explained that our piano was not overstrung, but made of all wood, with the strings strung on a metal frame. The candle holders on either side of the music stand long since removed. What was unusual, the piano was made of a pale yellowy-coloured wood. The action was lifted out and straddled the brass fender, dried in front of the fire. Eventually the squeaks from the stiffened action were reduced. The action was eased, and the weekly recital started when the washing of the tea things had been dried up and put away. The coal and logs had been fetched in, and my father had smoked his first pipeful of tobacco. The kitchen was at the end of the hall, next to the larder and dining room, now our sitting room. It was about 10 foot square and became the hub of family life. Most meals were eaten there. The ancient radio, with its fretted front, continually turned to the light programme. When first turned on in the morning, it emitted a series of high-pitched screeches and whines which lasted for about 2 minutes until the set warmed up. Woe betide anyone who changed the station waveband, because it was almost impossible to retune. The radio rested on a wide shelf held up by substantial metal brackets, one of which held all my father's rods and canes for checking us children. The rest of the shelf occupied by a row of graded saucepans and a large overfilled cupboard. There was a constant need to ward off the problems of damp. The woodwork and kitchen walls painted in gloss, a drab mustard colour that did nothing to raise the spirits. Their surface ran with condensation during the winter. Heating the house by coal fires and using gas to cook by contributed to the damp conditions. Doing the family's washing by boiling in a bucket, hanging wet washing on the air and boiling most vegetables contributed to the damp atmosphere. The main reason why the family washed in the kitchen was simply that it was the only warm room available in the whole house. Although there was a slate damp-proof course in the brickwork, there was no cavity wall. Under the downstairs floors there was a void of about 4 feet, which collected rising damp to the extent that it was permanently wet, in some places covered by a few inches of water. In the hottest summers this never completely dried out. The ventilation air bricks below floor level and in the upper walls were religiously blocked up by my father to prevent draughts. Though blocked, the wind blew through the gaps, separating the skirting board from the floor. All the doors and windows provided with draught excluders, torn strips of paper thrust through the gaps. Even so, it was a constant battle to save heat and prevent draughts. In winter the upstairs windows had ice on them all day, and this could last for days. Hot water from the tap was a luxury, certainly not appreciated by us children, made possible by over-stoking the kitchen fire until the boiler plate glowed red-hot, with sparks flying up the chimney. Everyone would draw back from the kitchen range, not because it was too hot, but because the boiler might explode or the chimney catch fire. Often the wood drying in the oven did. It was more normal to sit as close as possible, to the extent that red blotches appeared on those parts of the body closest to the fire. In winter, chestnuts would be cooked on the fire using an iron shovel. My father would split the chestnuts, and when cooked pass them to whomsoever to cool, tossing from one hand to the other, and then to peel. Whilst all this was going on, my mother darned, sewed, or knitted. My brother and I sat round a table that held a jigsaw. The fire heaped up, later bread or crumpets toasted. An alternative was baked potatoes in the ashes with a daub of butter. The plates would be passed round and the potatoes dug out with a fork, trying to save some of the butter from soaking in. The kettle put on for a cup of Horlicks, Ovaltine, or cocoa. It is difficult now to describe the enormous satisfying comfort and security attained by sitting round a smoking, crackling, ember-spitting fire on a cold winter's night, with the wind rattling the doors and the windows, the shadows of the flickering fire dancing on the walls, and the badly tuned radio drawing one ever closer to the tale being told. Quite often we would be engaged in constructing the jigsaw previously mentioned, dealing the cards for a game of whist, or standing up the dominoes whilst the potatoes in the ash can cooked, then passed round with a dab of margarine which was gradually melting on the plate. The boiled water from the kettle provided the hot water in the washing-up bowl for every need. The overhead rack, hoisted to the ceiling, was never empty of drying clothes and towels. This gave the kitchen a similar appearance experienced by prehistoric cave dwellers. If the walls had contained a recess for a bed, we would have slept in there too. The kitchen faced north, and the back door had been rehung to open outwards to give more space inside. Any attempt to open the door was resisted by all. Even the cat had to cross its legs. Our meals at home were repetitive, and the maximum use of every scrap, saving beef dripping, stewing the meat bones for stock and soups, mixing butter and margarine together, the butter bought from home and colonial stores, displayed on the marble shelf behind the counter. The desired lump cut off, salted, blended with a wooden cutter, and patted into shape with butter pats, leaving a fancy set of marks before placed into a grease-proof wrap. Coffee was never drunk. Being a middle-class beverage, we had camp coffee, essence from a jar which tasted nothing like coffee at all. All main shops had an errand boy who delivered the order by bicycle with a basket on the front. No one had a refrigerator. Dairy produce and meats would only last a few days depending on the weather. All larders had a cold slab made of marble, and roast beef and Yorkshire pudding the treat on Sunday. Cold cut Mondays. Tuesday was mince. Wednesday, cottage pie, rabbit or stewing steak. Thursday, and then fish on Friday, and perhaps ham Saturday. Puddings, desserts or afters, some sort of apple dish with custard, used as a pudding at every meal, even with rice pudding or tapioca. However, my mother persevered in all things which would probably save money, so puddings were invariably apple pie and custard. Next door's garden held a cooking cherry tree, the other neighbour apple, both vigorously scrumped, as were overhanging branches from trees along the road. I don't remember my mother ever turning down any scrumped apples. Our weekday clothes were bought second-hand, patched repeatedly and darned, to the extent that the foot of a sock was more darned than not. However, Sunday clothes had to be special, to give a good impression. To all the country, the wireless was the chief form of entertainment in the home. To us children, it was a liberating view of the wider world, something our parents never had, as well as an exciting form of whiling away moments between play. Derek McCulloch, better known as Uncle Mac, produced the BBC Children's Hour. This programme ended in 1964. There were many much-loved programmes, especially Out with Romany, written by Bramwell Evans in about 1938, who pretended to go out for countryside rambles with his dog Rack and 2 children. These nature-loving walks talked about finding birds' nests, walking beside a stream, climbing over stiles, and discussing how the weather affected the flora. All the interviewers and introducers were referred to as uncles and aunts. Then there was Toy Town, read by Uncle Mac, Derek McCulloch, and C.E. Hughes, the boy detectives Norman and Henry Bones. Castles and their history, and young artists. Wind in the Willows, read by David Davis and Norman Shelley, and many other wonderful stories. Later on, during the weekdays, the family spent most of the time in the kitchen as a special treat. Then most weekends we gathered round the fire in the sitting room. As routine, certain programs looked forward to and formed special moments of togetherness and companionship. Programs such as Monday Night at 8 with Gilly Potter, Grand Hotel, Henry Hall's Guest Night, and Dick Barton, of course, with his special agent, with Duncan Cass, Itmar and Tommy Handley, Happy Drome, Workers' Playtime, and boxing matches commentated by Eamon Andrews. Newsreaders such as Bruce Belfridge, Alan Howard, Stuart Hibbard, Ava Liddell, I remember, told us about the new tank battle in the Western Desert, which involved New Zealand troops, an enemy raid on Sidi Omar, and in Russia the Germans still made progress towards Moscow, and a small force of bombers attacked Brest and Cherbourg, or the Brains Trust with Professor Job, who always began an answer with, "It all depends on what you mean by." During the war, to achieve maximum working hours, the clocks put forward 2 hours, called double summertime. Later in the autumn, the clocks were only put back 1 hour to give summertime hours, sunrise being about 9 a.m. in December. This arrangement continued for many years, even after the war, to allow maximum daylight working hours. After the war, Saturday tea time about 5 o'clock, the full-time football results would be broadcast straight after the news. The sing-song voice of the announcer, enunciating the scores in such a way that the listener could guess the final result, would relay the information for the populace as a whole to take down the results, that they could find out if they had won the football prize and mark up their coupon. My mother would generally do the marking up by giving 1 point for a home, 2 for an away result, and 3 for a draw, counting the completed coupon for each line's result. How excited we all were as the scores mounted. Quite often my father would go to McFishery's fish shop to buy a pint of winkles, a small edible sea snail, for our tea. My mother would butter some bread, and he would bend some pins to winkle out the snail. They were lovely, and we considered them a treat. At weekends my father's main job was to put by sufficient chopped wood for the fire. Large planks and balks of wood sawn into logs using the family saw. This my father sharpened by knocking out every alternative tooth of the saw, and turning the saw over repeated the process the other side. If extra care taken, he would file the teeth as well. Oil rubbed into the saw to ease its passage through the wood, and for the last inch the log smashed to the ground to break it off. He would then chop the wood into pieces for both lighting the fire and into logs. If the axe or chopper proved difficult to cleave, then a hammer helped it. The back door, with fanlight above, led out to the backyard and garden. It was built into the centre of a low kitchen wall, next to a small window, dutifully clothed in its regulation net curtain, under which resided an ancient gas stove with polished brass taps. On the other side, the butler sink, with traditional wooden drainer above, which on shelves, a range of shelves containing toothbrushes and powder. Just imagine the whole family using the same tin of tooth powder. A whole range of never-to-be-disturbed cleaning fluids and mugs, their own layer of clinging dust and debris added to over the years. Underneath, hung on cup hooks, the flannel and dishcloth, scourer and bottle brush, ever in the way, swinging and swaying and dripping, occasionally dropping into your bowl. Opposite the back door, in the corner, the door to the hall. The rest a Welsh dresser and narrow-fitted broom cupboard. The top section of the dresser enclosed behind glazed doors covered by a patterned film, the tea and dinner service. Under the shelves, screwed cup hooks holding an assortment of cups, jugs and pots. 2 shelves contained all the family's pills and potions: Beecham's pills, Carter's little liver pills, aspirin, Friar's balsam, calamine lotion, corn plasters, band-aids, smelling salts, camphorated oil, cough mixtures, Vaseline, boracic powder, iodine, bandages and slings, syrup of figs for tummy upsets, castor oil, senna pods, camphorated oil, Epsom salts, various syringes and assorted safety pins. The bottom of the dresser housed all our toys too. On the side of the dresser next to the door, a pipe rack holding at least 6 pipes. A letter rack filled to the gills took up the rest of the space beneath. On the farther side, opposite the door, the broom cupboard, giving space to the mop, broom, dustpan and brush, dusters, candles, oil lamps, kindling for the fire, shoe cleaning gear, cod liver oil and malt, and all the family's everyday shoes. During the war, my father's rifle. Key men were issued with a rifle to shoot paratroopers and guard prisoners. This stood in the corner next to his chair whilst he polished his uniform. The gas pipes, competing with the rifle, ran up the wall to the meter perched on top, next to the torch and radio's earthing wire. The radio relayed the fateful message that September. I can remember distinctly the concentrated silence. The whole house was stilled as we listened to the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, tell the nation that Sunday, September the 3rd, 1939, that we were at war with Germany. I was 4, so it must have been quite an event etched into my very being to remember it. The following May, Churchill assumed office. The end of the month saw the retreat from Dunkirk. My life remained unaltered. I saw and felt no change whatever. It was not until that September that the air raids, the searchlights, the anti-aircraft guns began to focus attention on what was happening. It was really the London Blitz, after Hitler switched his forces from levelling Britain's airfields and radar chain, that the war made its first impact on my life. Then we could see and feel the difference. It took the victory at El Alamein and Stalingrad to mark a turning point, lead to ultimate victory. Still, that event was in the future, during which time I attended infant school and marked the map printed in the newspapers as our troops advanced, dropping back before advancing again. Every householder had to fill in a census form on the 29th of September 1939 detailing who lived in it or her house. This information enabled the government to issue identity cards, a national registration number and a ration book to each person. The whole nation was informed through the radio, newspapers and notices displayed in local shops how the system operated. How to register at local shops, how the shopkeeper was going to cut out and keep the counterfoils, how to fill in the ration book, name, address on each page and counterfoil. The counterfoil needed the date and the shop's name and address, elected as shop of choice for a period of 6 months. My mother had to queue as soon as the shop opened. There was often a scramble to make for the counter bearing what was currently in short supply. At home, what would have reminded the visitor that there was a war on was the rifle, propped up in the corner. My father was now in uniform, and his frequent trips away were a trial to my mother. The installation of the telephone all marked a change in routine. However, I was not unduly affected. Home life continued, governed by my mother's preferences and capabilities, based upon her past rural habits and upbringing. School dominated my life, indelibly linked to my great friend David Villas. Life continued. The kitchen remained the focus, dominated by the dresser, the toy cupboard, and always the fire. Between the broom cupboard and the sink strainer was the black kitchen range, built into the wall. All the cast iron and lead pipework ran along the kitchen wall from the kitchen range to the sink, then to the bathroom, hot water tank in the airing cupboard, and to the cold water tank housed in the loft. This patented, multi-purpose iron monstrosity contained the back boiler and bread oven. The bread oven was never used for that purpose, but to dry kindling, to light the fire in the morning. We lived in perpetual fear that the whole lot would catch fire, which it frequently did. Above the kitchen range was a mantel shelf, always crammed with a biscuit tin, fire-lighting spills, clock, candle holder, small box with drawers, letters, bills, postcards, and always the day's pipe, pouch, and my mother's cigarettes. Strung under this mantel-shelf was a washing line, hung the current tea-towel, and above the shelf a mirror, hanging from a string with postcards decorating the sides. In front of the range, surrounding the hearth, enclosing the wooden coppered sheath fender and upholstered coal boxes, the brass-railed fire-guard also served as a clothes horse. When young, we boys bathed in front of the fire in a tin bath that hung outside the back door, the towels stretched out warming on the guard, ready to dry us when we stepped out onto the hearthrug. Mondays were always washing days. the clothes placed in a large galvanized iron washing tub over the gas burner. A convex bottom plate kept the washing off the bottom from burning. The washing boiled with frequent turning and pummelling with a large wooden spoon. Soap suds came from soda crystals and shavings taken from a fairish soap block. The washed clothes then taken out of the boiler and ferried, dripping, to the sink to be rinsed. A Ricketts blue bag used in the rinsing water for all the whites, whilst collars and cuffs treated with robin starch. Once rinsed, the clothes were taken out to the backyard to be mangled, and then hung to dry. The mangle, like all the mechanical apparatus in the house, was never new to the family, and had seen better days. To extract the maximum water from the clothes, the tensioned roller springs were over-tightened by screwing down the tap-like screws at the top of the mangle. To then turn the rollers using the crank handle needed the strength of 10 men. The machine would creak and groan to spew out its charge flat as a board, sometimes with all the buttons split. The wrung-out clothes shaken out and hung on crossed washing lines that divided the backyard. If it rained, they were hung on the area in the kitchen, or placed on the clothes horse in front of the fire. Ironing day, a Tuesday, using flat irons heated on the gas stove. I can well remember my mother spitting on the iron to see if it was hot enough. The ironing done on a blanket laid on the kitchen table. My father's shirts with their detachable collars and cuffs pressed and polished using an iron. His trousers were pressed using an old tea towel to stop polishing the nap of the cloth, and then using soap from a thin bar run down the inside creases, then the whole ironed on the outside to give them extra sharpness. He always wore pinstripe trousers, black jacket and waistcoat, watch chain, black greatcoat, and highly polished shoes topped off with a bowler hat, and always carried a pair of leather gloves, briefcase, and furled umbrella during the day, or at night a silver-topped walking stick. Mother cleaned and tidied the house, but not to the extent that she could be accused of being house-proud. Life proceeded in an orderly manner with the rules laid down by my father. Meals expected at set times. The weekly routine never altered, made for continuity. A reliable, settled existence was maintained. There was very little formality except when an aunt came to tea and the front room was used. The few visitors who did visit came to see my mother, which was during the day, and only then for a cup of tea in the kitchen, where the teacups would be red. I don't remember my parents doing much dusting or carpet cleaning. The vacuum cleaner didn't work, and there were no feather dusters. Damp tea leaves were scattered over the carpet to be swept up using a dustpan and brush. The damp leaves attracted the dirt, and the collection achieved without causing more dust. This old Victorian habit took the place of sawdust. If there was any hard and dirty work like cleaning the gas stove, heavy gardening, hedge clipping, beating the rugs, blacking the stove, fetching the coal, cutting the wood, cleaning the shoes, decorating and cleaning all the brasswork, my father did it. My mother's main tasks were making the beds, seeing to the washing, ironing, and most importantly, planning the meals, doing the shopping, cooking and serving. Windows attended to by the window cleaner, the only outside labour my parents engaged, and that was only because he had a long ladder. There were never any arguments or discussions about what work had to be done. My mother wasn't in to do it yourself, or anything mechanical or electrical. When the carpets had to be cleaned, wet tea leaves were scattered and the carpet was hand-swept, or the U-bank cleaner used if it worked. This also applied to the sweeping of the stairs, done with a dustpan and brush. A spring clean was an annual event, and taken as an opportunity to take and apply some whitewash and distemper to the walls and ceilings. The Goblin vacuum cleaner was never used, to my knowledge, so it must have been broken. Nothing was ever wasted. Worn clothes were altered, patched or darned. Faded clothes were dyed, frayed collars turned, worn sheets topped and tailed, towels became flannels, and flannels became dishcloths, dishcloths consigned to the shed. Orange boxes became bedside cupboards, bricks used to take up room in the fire to save coal, buttons saved laced, hoarded wooden stores. Our wooden, basic kitchen furniture consisted of an old, dark, polished dressing table which had a hinged flap screwed onto one side. It was always covered with an off-white oilcloth which had 2 drawers to the front holding all the cutlery and kitchen utensils. Under the table was a box on roller bearings, pulled out for extra seating at meal times. A wooden carver and a folding wooden slatted chair made up the seating arrangements, augmented by a deck chair, naturally claimed by my father. The whole floor was covered in painted linoleum, with a carpet square on top, further reinforced by another rug just before the fender, linking the upholstered box ends holding the dried sticks for lighting the morning fire. For some strange reason, our taps would drip incessantly. Part of my father's regular duties was to change the washers. The tap's washers were held in a spigot tightened into the base by the tap. The tap assembly held into the body by a nut, the size of which our toolbox could never ever provide a spanner for. An adjustable spanner was the universal tool used in almost all cases where a spanner was required. Unfortunately, the adjustable screwing mechanism was deficient of its stub screw. This unfortunately was missing, so you had to hold the adjusting screw in with your first finger and thumb whilst turning the wrench. I well remember the U-bend in the kitchen sink blocking, and my father doing his usual fixing, which involved minimum preparation by him and maximum nervous energy by the rest of the family, to keep out of the way, pretending that all was normal. I was fascinated by the more than excessive grunting and banging, so inquired how he was getting on. He explained the intricacies he was experiencing, trying to make a repair using the much-used toolkit on a more than stubborn nut. I don't know what came over me, but I remember how I thought he was being a bit of a twat. I said this, and he leapt to his feet, whilst banging his head on the bottom of the sink. I retreated at speed, he meanwhile shouting out that I ought to know what I was saying, and that I should look up the word in a dictionary. Later I did just that, finding out that I'd called him a female genital. I felt such a fool, and I've never used that term again. All this was typical and part of life at home, for anyone using our tools had to be adaptable, versatile and quick-thinking whilst maintaining a cool exterior and a positive outlook always. Just look at any of the nuts in our house and you would see they all had rounded sides, made by slipping spanners and wrenches. I've known my father resort to tapping a screw round with a screwdriver and hammer, which made the already rounded nut lethal for unsuspecting users. The tiles which surrounded the kitchen sink didn't help because they were only a millimetre away from the tap. There was not a great deal of space to do any repairs. Having the flannel and the dishcloth hanging up under the overhead cupboard were also very handy, for they provided extra grip. Such things were not considered important enough to move. were after all handy to stem any blood that flowed, caused by the slipping pipe wrench. Job preparation by my father was always a little sketchy, because he always approached any task with a positive approach. Everything had to be done at speed. To repair a leaking tap, he sought out just one spanner. This meant that he was always going backwards and forwards to the tool shed, gradually to work through our set of prehistoric tools. Gradually the kitchen drainer would represent an artisan's workbench. Holes would appear in the surface, and bits sawn off the sides made it look as if termites had been at work. These incidences made up much of my home life, later on used to bring laughter to family gatherings, and remembered with relish. The stairs led up to a landing, with 4 doors above, and by trapdoor the entry to the loft above. The insulation lagging to the loft pipework and cold storage tank was sketchy at the very best of times, and every year saw the annual freeze-up, when the pipes and the inlet valve to the storage tank had to be thawed out. Ice used to block the ballcock valve, which prevented the water flowing into the cold water tank and blocked the rainwater down the pipes. Quite often the small paraffin heater put into the loft at night to stop the pipes from freezing up didn't work at all. My brother and I thought this exciting. To my father it was a calamity. He had to fetch the small ladder from the outside to reach the trapdoor on the landing, then to fumble his way round the loft so that he could see where the day's blockage had occurred. It was usually the inlet valve and a short section of pipe which led from it. Hot water bottles passed up through the hatch, candles, paraffin lamps lit to thaw out the pipes, and with any luck there would be a hissing noise and the water would start to flow again back into the cold water tank. The bathroom at the head of the stairs contained the airing cupboard, the bottom half filled with an oblong galvanized hot water tank, the top half bed linen and yesterday's ironing. Bathing was so rare that I cannot even remember it. Obviously it did occur when we were small children, only because so very little water was necessary. The water was heated by a very small back boiler sited at the back of the kitchen range. Most of its heat needed in the kitchen, not up the chimney, past the boiler. The hot water system at one time did operate fairly efficiently, but later on, particularly during the war, a limit of 4 inches of water for bathing and a restriction placed on the amount of coal available certainly stopped a good soak in the bath. A strip wash being the order of the day, most days. My father shaved and washed in the kitchen very early in the morning, before we children surfaced. My mother did her ablutions later during the day, in peace and quiet when we were at school. Normally hot water provided by a kettle carried upstairs for those who were shy, that required privacy. Each of the bedrooms, except for the box room, had a small cast-iron fire grate and surrounds. These were lit on very special occasions, an illness or the birth of my youngest brother. Before the hearth a fender gave boundary to a small hearth rug. Both rooms had carpet squares with an outer border of linoleum. All the rooms in the house had the walls papered. This claim to middle-class convention continued for many years. The wallpaper, purchased from the hardware shop, needed the lap removed to match up the pattern, achieved with a pair of scissors. Eventually the manufacturers cut this off, and over the years my father, tired of papering and decorating the walls, resorted to distempering, straight over the paper, a very simple solution. The windows, curtained with the addition of nets by convention, were always drawn and never pulled back. My brother and I were shepherded off the bed promptly at 9, armed with a sock-wrapped hot water bottle and tucked up in bed with 2 good-night prayers. There are 4 corners to my bed, there are 4 angels at its head, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, bless the bed that I lay on. Alternatively, God bless Mummy, God bless Daddy, make me a good boy, Amen. Whichever, the calming influence of the familiar words soon had us off to sleep, and outside the owls hooted, the cats screamed as the ghostly trains hurried by, trailing smoke and steam, their whistles fading away in the black night. Beyond the back door lay the concreted backyard, which ran, to the width of the house, side passage, and about 14 feet out into the garden. Today, a backyard might be elevated to the more modern term of patio. To the right-hand side, facing the rear of the house, were 2 coal sheds, one for coke, the other for coal, which also held the logs for the fire and kindling. My father, at regular intervals, had delivered from his rail yard a lot of used wood, and over time this was cut up and chopped for firewood. The garden shed, with laid brick floor, nestles next to the coal sheds, in the corner of the yard. Inside, a workbench, and a number of shelves lined the walls. To us boys, the shed was a source of continual mystery and experiment, and gave us lots of enjoyment and excitement. It was packed with a variety of useless tools and half-used materials, piled on top of each other, each vying with each other for space. The roof beams held a collection of nails, hooks, screws, each supporting another collection of articles of fascination and awe. We children looked upon the garden shed as a sort of Aladdin's cave. Its very deepest corners held untold secrets. Access was supposed to be denied to us, initially by a padlock, in time picked so often that eventually was left unlocked. An old German helmet, a First World War trench periscope, numerous boxes of assorted nuts and bolts, all rusting into a solid lump, tools which might have graced a workman's bag in the mid-1800s, many sizes of sawn wood, sheets of tin, deck chairs with broken bottom struts and torn covers which challenged the boldest user, fold-in slatted chairs and a table of indefinite vintage. It was all inviting, and we children used all its resources to construct gang huts, tree houses, soapbox carts, stilts and cricket bats. The assorted tools had the look of Iron Age implements. Saws lacked teeth, hammers had rounded heads which turned over every nail hit, spanners that were adjustable but were never designed with that in mind, and wrenches, jemmies, gauges and rulers, long since losing their working life. Though vice would have done justice to a blacksmith's forge, it could have held the most stubborn of rusted nuts, except that the turning screw on the shank had such enormous play it was impossible to make any sort of final adjustment. From the pole nailed to the nearest corner of the shed ran the radio aerial, strung between 2 porcelain separators. The wire passed through the kitchen window, along the shelf, into the ancient wireless set there, held in its aerial socket by a matchstick. We were all very concerned when there was an electrical storm that this arrangement would attract a lightning bolt when we expected the house to go up in flames, or at least the radio to give its final shriek. I do remember my father resurfacing the backyard, and like everything else my father did, the task was to be completed with minimum effort at maximum speed, and to achieve that the procedure had to follow a set plan. Unfortunately, the plan didn't include the right dress, proper preparation, correct tools, or the best materials in the correct proportions. My father would approach the job in his normal rig of the day, giving the job its proper recognition of difficulty and respecting it by rolling up his sleeves and presenting his braces after taking off his waistcoat. As with all the family's tools, this screwdriver had the extra task of doubling up to become multi-purpose. Large screwdrivers were filed down to take small screws, and the coal shovel to act as a trowel, wood rasps to smooth metal, metal files to smooth wood, and speed was essential for all tasks. Any difficulty was overcome by muscle power, and all onlookers were bamboozled by an enormous flurry of arms and legs. Fine-tuning and attention to detail were given due respect by a fine selection of hammers. They all had rounded heads and heads that flew off at unexpected times. All these would have to be proved to be a mountain to be climbed, but the job was still possible if the day arrived. A load of sand was delivered and a quantity of cement obtained. The cement, long past its sale-by date, with bags split, was comprised of large lumps. These lumps had to be broken up, crushed and sieved to produce some semblance of the original powder. In crushing, the pile assumed a smaller density. It looked as if it might be in short supply. The sand, too, had its own variety of foreign particles, and came from a number of sources, and multi-grained. A tin bath employed to hold the cement mixture had a quantity of sand and cement added. The dual-purpose coal shovel agitated and mixed a slightly aqueous, gritty substance ready for spreading. The yard contained the mangle, a large box very much like a cold frame which held firewood, the rabbit hutch, and sundry other bits and pieces. This extraneous matter treated as part of the permanent structure by its longevity. It was never moved. It is said in the army that if something moves you salute it, and if it doesn't you paint it. This general rule applied at home. There are other secondary rules. What is moved might have to be put back, and out of sight is out of mind. And if you have a surplus, you might have to get rid of it. It has always stood countless soldiers in good stead to apply these basic rules. There are, however, another two, which did not apply in this instance, although we children used them on countless occasions. Do not be caught not carrying something, and if moving abroad in daylight hours, do so urgently. My father was an old soldier. The mixture was now ready for spreading. It soon became apparent that using the right proportions of 6:1, the cement would soon run out. Therefore savings would have to be put in place, so father decided that an 8:1 mixture would have to do, and after all, there wouldn't be a lot of wear on the surface. And even this lean mixture found to eat away the now valuable cement pile. Subsequent mixings saw a very sandy mixture, getting worse. The planned concreting was now adapted. It was soon discovered that the shovel was not up to the job in hand. The wooden handles dropped off, meant holding the metal sleeve. Some of the cement stuck to the surface of the shovel, which steadily grew thicker, increasing its weight. This never came off and dried solid. That didn't slow down the job, only made my father speed up. Soon, a simpler spreading technique had to be adopted, for time was now getting on. My father, his patience wearing thin, tried to get the job over quickly. The yard broom was used, like all brooms of our house, and required tapping down first to ensure that the head was securely attached to the handle, which it never was, no matter how much it was tapped down or how many nails or screws put in. It always flew off. It was not odd to see a screw hammered in to secure the handle instead of a nail. This was viewed, like many others, as a temporary fixing, awaiting a more permanent job later on. It was never successful. It could have had many nails of mixed parentage sticking into the head like a porcupine, some ovals, others round, with or without heads. Numbers did not always guarantee a firm result. Now, by watering down the mixture, a coat of light grey sandy cement could be brushed on. Here was a solution at last. Here the technique that would solve all the problems. There was now not much time to do the job, and a degree of muscle power had to be made available after much effort, tamping to achieve level and smoothness, and sort out the now obvious lack of materials. Soon the job was completed. Tools were put away, with their own coating of cement, especially the shovel. The broom, now the multi-purpose leveller and spreader, was the last tool to be used. Walking backwards, brushing as one went, could not be dunked in the water barrel to clean it off, so retained ever afterwards a healthy amount of grit. It didn't take long for the oncoming rain to cause its own effects upon the drying mixture. Small rivulets of grey cement channelled its way down the garden steps onto the lawn, making the end result something like the Ganges Delta. Ever afterwards the yard grated under one's feet, and a thick dust cloud blew around the side entrance. It was never the same again. I don't remember the yard ever being free of grit that swirled around in any sort of wind. The garden, which led off the backyard, was to be found below a series of brick steps cut into the bank leading down to the lawn. Privet hedges separated the steps from the flower beds on either side, which were planted with marigolds, Michaelmas daisies, roses and sweet William, and at the bottom, just before the lawn, Mum's favourite London Pride. A random curved stone path ran to the ditch at the bottom of the 60-foot garden. This ditch was a drain, a tributary of the River Pin, enclosed in a 4-foot diameter concrete pipe. Flower beds ran down each side of the garden from top to bottom, and at the bottom of the garden was an oval bed, and the side farthest away from the house was 4 small trees. This oval flower bed was, during the first part of the Second World War, our air raid shelter. Unfortunately, it was always filled with rainwater and never used. The Oppin Trench was a risky playground, not a saviour of skins. Many games involved landscaping earth, mud and stones to form the American West and provide our lead cowboys and soldiers with an out-west backdrop, or Indian plains, and an enactment of the part played by soldiers in khaki of the Empire. There. That is it then. The answer to the question. My first memory were games with lead soldiers taken out of their boxes that were kept in the kitchen dresser and set up for a battle, whether inside the house or outside in the garden. Mostly, however, our Never Never Land was at the bottom of the garden, well away from the house, and when something required tools, it was to the shed and Dad's workbox we went. First, though, to get past the lock, we became very adept lock pickers. Fortunately, they were very simple locks. The garden steps, flanked by 2 rather moth-eaten variegated leafed privet hedges, led down to the lower garden and lawn. These 6 steps were our second choice play area. Gladiatorial, their brick construction, their going 1 brick high, and treads 2 stretcher bricks deep were about a yard wide. These proved a number of wheeled contraption with a suitable descent. The steps represented for us what the Cresta Run does for downhill skiers, although the sides were considerably rougher than tape or netting, being a rather spiky privet hedge. To ease the descent, boards propped up to take away the bumps to make a smoother ride. Initially, when it had all its wheels, our first carriage was a horse on wheels. This was later substituted by a rather wobbly tricycle. Unfortunately, its large single front wheel, difficult to keep a straight line, caused many mishaps. A pedal car came third, but suffered from having a rather low chassis, which tended to ground. And finally, a home-built, soapbox-on, pram-wheeled go-kart, boasting many modifications, add-ons and adaptations, all designed to surplus all others. It was to be the fastest thing on wheels. Extra propulsion was provided by a gentle guiding hand that gave it an initial start. This gentle start was soon to become a more vigorous push, which considerably increased momentum. And after a go each, excitement being then at its peak, the push turned itself into an enormous heave, taken at a spirited run. This upping of the danger levels from running shove to gigantic heave always ended in catastrophe. Me crying. My brother, with hands on hips, adopting a superior stance, demanding what I was crying for. My mother rushed out of the kitchen door, demanding what was wrong. These were some of my first impressions of play, when I was 4. Friday the 1st of September 1939 was a momentous day. Germany invaded Poland, completely subjugating the nation in 4 weeks. In a similar number of days the defeat of Holland followed. Chamberlain's declaration was the following Sunday. Holland, Belgium and Luxembourg invaded and overrun, and shortly afterwards the great retreat began, ending with an evacuation from Dunkirk on June the 4th. My brother started school the next day, which was a far more monumental event for me. Prior to the war being declared, the government considered whether air raid shelters should be built, not for individuals but for high-ranking government employees or particular scientists living in a range of enemy bombers. It was decreed that particular individuals could apply for special dispensation. Local councils would deliver free shelters to individuals in need, mostly families, but only in specific danger zones. There were 2 types of air raid shelter for families. The Anderson shelter, named after the then Home Secretary, Sir John Anderson, which was a corrugated iron structure with a domed roof for outside, and could be either partially sunk in the garden or completely buried, and this catered for a maximum of 6. They were extremely damp, suffered from condensation, and needed to be properly installed with sump and pump, or proper drainage channel routed to a soakaway. A special bombast wall was needed to protect the entrance. The other one was a 3-foot-high steel-topped table with a steel mesh side for use inside the house. This was a Morrison shelter, devised by Herbert Morrison. It wasn't long before both types were unused, being far too inconvenient, people preferring to hide under the stairs, in basements or under the kitchen table, particularly the latter, for it was warmer there. Street shelters to provide for the population of a small road was a windowless, oblong, brick-built structure with a flat 9-inch reinforced concrete roof. And these were built at convenient places throughout North Harrow. Our nearest one was stationed near the crossroads at the end of the road. Its main fault was when there was a near miss, the bomb blast would collapse the walls and the very heavy roof would crush those inside. They were extremely cold, airless, damp and smelly, had neither light nor heat, and didn't boast a door or window. I don't remember anyone ever using one. In retrospect, they were a waste of money and effort. Those shelters which did save thousands of lives were those that had been purposely built deep, mainly underground railways during the Battle of Britain, the most critical period, and people bought platform tickets and waited underground until the all clear sounded. Later, the government realised the benefit and allowed people to enter the platforms after dark, free of charge, planned a proper organised arrangement for Londoners using the underground railway system. At the outbreak of the war, Father dug a trench at the bottom of the garden, a shallow trench with sandbagged walls. He scoffed at the more conventional design as being death traps, declaring that a slit trench was far more serviceable. From a military standpoint, this was undoubtedly true, allowing easy access and escape. However, for a purely practical family shelter, suitable for all weathers, a more conventional structure with a roof would have been much better. Still, as our shelter was never put to the test, I don't remember any of my friends needing to use their shelters either. Perhaps my dad was right. Even during the most frightful of raids, our family never so much as retired to the cupboard under the stairs. What garden furniture did grace the lawn was skimpy, consisting of a seat on a canopied swing and a handmade garden bench painted green. At the right-hand corner of the garden, a tall copper beech tree, our tree house, accessed by a rope ladder. A swing, single or double ropes tied onto a lower branch. The tree was also, in extremis, an escape route to a part of the tree as far away as possible from my father's reach, who waited with diminishing patience at the bottom with his cane. Next door, the Tripps had an enormous Lombardy poplar tree which dominated the area, taking all the goodness out of the surrounding gardens. During and just after the war, we kept chickens, as a number of other families did too, and occasionally a rabbit. Our family was never without a tabby cat. It often monopolised Mum's lap, playing with the knitting wool, and whose kittens arrived in frequent litters. Separating all the neighbouring gardens was an open wooden fence tightly enclosed behind obligatory privet hedges. At the bottom of the garden, a close boarded fence indicated the boundary, dividing us from the houses in Canterbury Road. At its foot ran a ditch and stream, a tributary of the River Pin. This stream had been contained in a 4-foot diameter concrete pipe and served as a storm drain. Fortunately, the boundary hedge totally screened us from our neighbours at the bottom by tall hedges and trees, probably the original hedges dividing the farmer's field. Dig for Victory, wartime allotments, the kitchen front, the kitchen waste collection and pig club were all government initiatives instigated to provide incentives to spur people on, to help themselves and others. The object was to become independent and self-sustaining. It was declared unpatriotic by a government official to feed birds or throw anything away which could be recycled. The lawn, laid on either side of the garden path, from the bottom of the steps to the oval flower bed at the other end of the garden, was undulating, because at the start of the war garden owners were encouraged to dig up their lawns and turn them into allotments, which my parents did. As far as that went, all was well. When it came to planting the seeds, pricking out, spacing, nurturing, and bringing on, the whole plan faltered, finally collapsed. Like most other plans, it came to naught. Grass was replanted and levelled off. The indentations were never totally made good. The lawn assumed the feature of an ancient burial site. The already much-used lawn-mower, an apology for a gardening aid, never had its blade sharpened or set, and would have graced any respectable antique shop. The adjusting nuts, like all nuts in the house, had rounded corners, by frequent attention, and did the job without the necessity of locking nuts. The uninitiated who attempted fine-tuning ended up having bruised and blooded knuckles. The selection of spanners of doubtful manufacture acquired over the previous industrial age were impressive in size and assortment, but rarely delivered up the correct size. The keen do-it-yourselfer had to resort to many devices to get round the problem. Many times my father would dance round cursing and shaking his fist, hurling many and varied abuses at the mower. The mower's driving roller operated the cutters by an adjustable chain, which had so much play in it that it often fell off. This result, however, was secondary to the lack of sharp blades properly set. The handlebars, covered by rubbered grips, over time were worn and torn, and they rubbed raw blisters on your hands. Quite often I would stand on the roller, scrape a blade to give the roller extra gripping power, to stop it slipping on the mud, and increase the weight so that the many bumps in the lawn were further flattened. This slipping of the smooth back roller also added to the grass becoming squashed, scuffed, and made many flattened mud patches. None of this was helped by the handles of the mower being adjusted too low. The pusher always started with a slight stoop, which would progress to become like a potato picker, doubled up. The reader had to picture all this going on with my father, who never removed his jacket, and always insisted on wearing his waistcoat, and continued to wear long johns even during the hottest of summers. He wanted to show the neighbours that everything was going according to plan, that the mowing was effortless, accomplished by panache and skill, even when the chain had jammed and the stationary rollers skidded on the muddy surface. My father used oil and grease on the mower as tools rather than lubricants. A trail of black slime followed the mower wherever it went. Today the mower would be an heirloom, and much sought after, fetch a tidy sum at the antique roadshow. The slack driving chain contributed to the already worn-down driving sprocket. The front wooden rollers had always been there, partially rotted away by being left out with mud and grass cuttings over the winter months. Overall, it was an excuse of a lawn. The weeds grew abundantly, provided extra pocket money for us boys to prize them out with a weed trowel, and the depressions created pools of water unable to escape from the present glutinous clay soil. One flower bed held 2 apple trees, a cooker, and a very sweet red dessert apple. Both trees produced apples so small and worm-eaten that they were hardly worth peeling. That never put my mother off extracting the maximum from what the garden offered, paring the apples with film-like peelings, or accepting next door's bitter cherries to help them out. Apple pie was Mum's forte, first and last. If the Carey family had fortitude, stamina, and endurance, then it was the result of Mum's apple pies. There's no doubt that by the end of 1940, the nation had developed a core of fortitude. It was not obvious to the casual onlooker, but underneath showed itself increasingly by grim determination, a flame that was not going to be extinguished.